no introduction, but he does need thanking. So you'll see here a PowerPoint of the chief investigator's really heartfelt feelings of gratitude for what Nick has achieved. But first of all, I'll ask Kate to come and say a few words.
Thank you, Jane. Now I fess up to once not being a great fan of Centres of Excellence, but that's really changed. In fact, it changed, I think, the day, Nick, you sent me that document, which was the application to the ARC. I don't think you sent me the entire 500 pages or whatever it was, but certainly the highlights. And what I read there really took my breath away. And of course, I've been lucky enough to see, firsthand the achievements of the centre, or the centrate at work over the last 8.5 years. My role has been very tiny, but I feel extremely lucky at being able, that giving me the opportunity to see these remarkable achievements firsthand, as I said. I'm looking at Dan, yes, that's one centre of excellence. Yeah, we were talking about Crocodile Dundee at breakfast, so this is really an extraordinary centre of excellence. And I don't know whether it was, nostalgia or red wine that made me revisit the first notes that I made before that very first meeting of the advisory board all those years ago. And it really drove home to me what an important contribution, or the valuable advice that was given by Jeff Ellman at that time. I really relied on him, particularly his experience of centres and his remarkable wisdom, but it's been like that with all of the members of the advisory board. I feel incredibly privileged to be working, or have been working alongside such a remarkable bunch of people, so I thank them all. What else was I going to say that, no, I only know I've got a few minutes. Well, let me finish actually with what, and I've already told Nick this, but it was the words of Jeff Ellman really, and it became like a catchphrase, well, for me, working, within the advisory board. Jeff said right at the beginning, he said, well, CoEDL's such an enormous scale, incredible enterprise. How can it be more than the sum of the parts, he said. And then he said, well, the parts are great and the centre's excellent, perhaps the sum of the parts is enough. But then, I just wish he could be here, particularly the last 3 days, to see the real fruit of a centre that is truly interdisciplinary, that is, real cooperation, real collaboration. It's been remarkable. CoEDL is just so much greater than the sum of the parts, and in so many wonderful ways, and I just wanted to thank you too for letting me be part of this adventure. Thank you.
To do what we want, so I'm a bit embarrassed by that. Thank you all. I'm touched and a bit thrown out because I didn't think there was anything like that on the agenda, and I certainly was hoping there wouldn't be. So anyway, if I can just sort of put aside my emotions for a moment, when Raphael saw the first slide before it was unceremoniously whipped off the screen, he said, well, are we to take that in the English or the Aymara sense, looking back and looking forward? And as any of you who know Raphael's work on Aymara, that looking back will mean looking back to the future and looking forward to the past. It's a reminder of how different languages are in the views they bring. And I deliberately chose that particular photo, which I took a year ago during lockdown. Actually, we sneaked off with a few friends down at the Southern ACT, just to show us that when I'm thinking of Wolfgang's Mount Everest slide yesterday with a sort of triumphal peak, but I deliberately cut that photo because it's not very clear how far up you are. If you do a lot of hiking, you know that you think you're at the top, and then you look up and there's a whole big steep Morbid to climb up, and that's very much what science is, right? You move a certain way along the track, and then you discover that, Jesus, I'm right, I'm not even at base camp yet. So the mixed emotions, which I'm feeling, and I'm sure many of you are feeling, Hedvig just asked me before, are we going to cry during this? And probably, that's part both of a personal engagement with every one of you and all of the people in this incredible CoEDL community that we've been so lucky to be a part of, and it's also something to do with our sense that we've been able to both study language and reach out to the community about language in an unparalleled way over the last 8.25 years, and we now face this point of that was wonderful, and what next? Of course, one thing that is next is that the year in which CoEDL ends is the year in which the International Decade of Indigenous Languages begins, which let's hope that in 2033 we will enter the International Century of Indigenous Languages, and that's something for us to work toward until we reach the International Millennium of Indigenous Languages and so on. But it's a really important moment. I really liked Corey's phrasing of an acknowledgement of country. It's more than an acknowledgement of country. We can easily fall into the trap of words. Yes, it's better to have these acknowledgements of country than not to have them, and to remind ourselves of something that's both an act of respect and a political act, that we stand on unceded lands, but it's much more than that. And as we witness what's happening in the parts of the Ukraine which are being annexed by Russia as we speak, unlawfully, and I would bet that 99% of Australians are outraged by that, but that's exactly what happened here as well. So, thanks, Corey, for reminding us through your stronger form of wording about that, and there's a danger, I think, that acknowledgements of country just slip into a sort of ritualised thing. It's always important to remind ourselves of what we are really saying with them, important as they are. The one part of the CoEDL logo that I didn't mention in my opening address was the part which isn't there. That is the white spaces which form an emergent circle. And that, like every other aspect of the logo, was something we put there on purpose because we wanted to show that language is emerging. And as Steve put it in his talk, it's designed without a designer, like a number of other features of human culture. We get to say the same about human kinship and a number of other things. And what's very special about the languages of the world, there's 7,000 more of them and all of the other ones that have ever been, is how exquisitely intricate and finely tuned they are to the people who use them, to the point where they're still one of the great unsolved wicked problems for the burgeoning informatics industry. That's still one of the most difficult problems that they face, which is an indication that they're incredibly complex. And they're also incredibly different, as we know and have heard so much about in the last 3 days. The term the long tail is often used. That image there is something I Googled. I just Googled Benedict Mandelstam, the founder of fractals, and long tail, and that's one of the images that came up. And many of the languages we study and the communities that we deal with are out at the slender end of the long tail in terms of numbers of populations, in terms of resources and so on. I think a beautiful thing about the language sciences is it reminds us that being down there at the slender end in no way implies anything about lack. There's deficit discourses right and left, or in Australia's dealings with its First Nations peoples and comparable things around the world, and yet as linguists, when we approach the languages of Indigenous Australia, of New Guinea, of the Pacific and many other places, we are constantly mesmerised by what has emerged there and by the surprises that we find there. And each one of those is a scientific challenge. Those scientific challenges and questions range from very large questions, like why are the languages of the world so diverse? What are the outer limits to how diverse they can be? Why is there so much diversity in some parts of the world rather than others? That's just one set of questions, and one of the things that John was tackling just now, of course, in his talk. And that's a question which we can't say, yes, now we've got the answer to that. It's a question that's a very complex one that will require us to integrate material from many parts of the world. And then there are lots of small questions in the sense that they're more detailed ones. We can think back to yesterday as one example where Tina was talking about verbs which supplete for the gender of their object in Yelmic, something which no other language in the world has been reported to do. And a question to her, how do you think this evolved? The only honest answer is we don't know at the moment, right? So when you get some new phenomenon, it's a particular sort of what question, there are other questions about it, how questions, what it's used for, how did it come about questions, evolutionary questions, and so on. Or just today, for example, Rosie mentioned we have had no studies of how children learn labial velar stops. That's another question at the intersection of a particular what, that is the labial velar stop, and the course of learning a language. And there are so many of these thousands, I'd say hundreds of thousands, millions of small questions which are then integrated with a lot of large questions we have. And I think something that we've tried to do in CoEDL, I think we've managed to do it at least to some extent, is to integrate all along the tail, right? Because we want to know what's happening with all of those things which could easily be just seen as odd outliers with the things that we know about from the big or better known languages, and can then use that tail, just like the tail on a kangaroo is an organ of propulsion, to drive along our field. I have a recurrent nightmare. I hope it will stop on the 31st of December maybe of this year. In this nightmare, a scary figure from the ARC, not Liz Vischer, I hasten to add, approaches me in this sort of black suit or something, and says, well, Nick, did CoEDL transform the science of language? You get $28 million from the ARC, and that was matched by huge amounts from 4 universities and all of your partners. Did you do it? And of course, there's no simple answer. to that question. When we think of what science is, there are, as I've just said, there are what questions. What sort of things are out there? There are why questions, and we want to understand why certain things happen. But as we heard from Janet yesterday when she was talking about Brian Arthur on technology, we can apply that to science and say that science is also about the community of scientists and researchers. And there we lead into how questions. That is, how is research done? Is there a transformation going on in that towards more co-design, participatory models of doing science, which reflect the way that the communities we work with want to do science? And who questions? We know that, to a shame, we began CoEDL and we remained in CoEDL with a set of chief investigators, a set of partner investigators, none of whom have been Indigenous. That's something that in the future should not be the case. Those transformations don't take place overnight, but I think you could feel through these 3 days that the sands are shifting, and that we will be moving towards very soon a point where that will just be completely obvious and natural and enriching. So those how and who questions are also a part of transforming the science of language. And of course, as linguists, when we classify verbs into telic verbs with endpoints and activity verbs which go on, I think transforming is a member of both classes, right? And so I think that transforming the science of language is as much an activity, but never stops, because science never rests. And I put this quote here initially from Wilhelm von Humboldt. I love it a lot. Every language draws about the people that possesses it, a circle, whence it is possible to exit only by stepping over at once into the circle of another one. This is one of the things that fascinates us about language, that in learning another language we enter another way of being, another worldview. But we could also say every discipline does that. And Belinda Hoffmeyer said to me during one of the breaks today that something she noticed about the last 3 days, I hadn't noticed it myself, but I was really heartened to hear that, was that the talks were so much clearer than when we started. People are understanding each other better. Because at the beginning we had, frustrated people from information science sort of getting hot under the collar, that someone would say earlier, but expect to know what it was, and vice versa from the linguistic side and so on. And I think it was true. And this process that we've gone through has led us all to expand to a new circle that has enabled us to talk to each other in ways where we are now on the same page in some ways and can carry things forward. So, as I've said, science never rests. You solve one problem and another one appears. As we've worked through CoEDL, we began with an initial set of questions. It's not like we were totally locked into those ones. We did have a certain amount of flexibility, but there's lots of new areas, areas like gesture and sign language, for example, which weren't part of our initial design, and they've emerged from so many different directions during the course of CoEDL as being vitally important. And we heard from Jess earlier today, for example, about great stuff that's happening there. And there's Lauren Reed's photograph of her work on these amazing, very, very localised sign languages that are emerging in so many parts of Papua New Guinea, and that sort of exhibit the same sorts of levels of diversity in sign language that you see in other forms of spoken language, and that's something that sort of grew out of a particular CoEDL initiative. So there's many of these. I just put on the right-hand side that little tree diagram of some languages of the world, Indo-European ones and then some Uralic ones. And one of the very ambitious tasks we set ourselves at the beginning was the task of a sort of global phylogeny of the world's languages. Geneticists can tell us how all human populations fit together. Linguists can't. We can only, if we think of a vast eucalyptus tree that's been chopped down, and then some gardeners come along with a little pruner and cut off all the twigs towards the bottom and then just chuck those on a pile somewhere. That's what we have with our existing tools. We can't reassemble them into a tree. We had hoped to get further along that path and through collaborations, for example, with our colleagues in Leipzig, and we haven't got very far on that, to be honest. So this is, some problems take a long time to make advances on, but I think we've set some of the stones in place to begin building that. Something else that's really important as CoEDL and CoEDLers being, let's say, citizen linguists, is putting languages into the fabric of our life. I photographed that little carry bag the other day in Arga, which translates as the land needs words. We just heard numerous times that in the indigenous cosmologies of Australia, language comes out of the land. It's certainly very true. That whole practice of speaking the language of where we are is a form of respect. If we go into, let's say, Auckland Airport, we see Maori and we see English under it. We're not guaranteed to have equivalent experiences flying into Australian international airports. There's a couple of regional airports where we have that. We've come some distance, but not very far. And we also know incredibly little about what languages are spoken in Australia. So when we put the initial proposal together, we said we thought that about 25% of Australians spoke another language. We don't actually know. It's really incredible. If you look at the current census, does the person use a language other than English at home? Now, what if you do use another language than English, but it's in other places than at home? Then that's invisible to the question. What does use a language mean? Like, if I just use one swear word, does that count? And down the bottom, or somewhere there's a point that you're just supposed to mention one language, right? Maybe that's just off the screen. So if someone speaks 3 languages, only 2 of them, and if one of them is English, it's all right, but there'll be significant data loss. Now compare that with our New Zealand analogues. In which language or languages could you have a conversation about a lot of everyday things? So there's at least some definition of what's meant. Remember to mark English. If you can have a conversation in English, then there's a list, and then you can list other languages, as many as you want. Okay, so there's accurate gathering of data in New Zealand that we don't have here. Often when I've spoken to people about getting good data through the Australian census, they say, oh, everyone wants to add new questions to the census. One question, one question. That's not adding new questions. It's just redesigning the questions. There are, of course, interesting supplements. So if you look at the Scottish census, you can, that thing's fallen away, but you can Google it. One of the questions is, do you speak Scots? And you might know whether you do or not, because of course Scottish can be a little difficult to understand if you've come from somewhere else. And then you have a choice of about 12 online videos where you can listen to people speaking and decide whether you speak Scots or not. So there's lots of imaginative things we can do there. And you need to do it if we are to put languages, put words on the land and maintain the languages that we are very lucky to have spoken in this country. And one of the reasons is if we think of all of these hundreds and hundreds of languages, we know that much is true in Australia, as the capillaries of our national communication. We know that English is the artery, but the artery doesn't get you everywhere. If your capillaries die in part of your brain or part of your toe, you have a stroke or you get frostbite. And we need to know about those capillaries. And we found that out to a cost during the COVID pandemic, when there were all sorts of bugger-ups with getting information out, such as the famous case of people, I think it was using Arabic script for Persian, or like just mixing things up like that, and then lots of other people who were just told to, who were just locked in to high-rises without being told why, and there were lots of bottom-up initiatives, some very admirable ones organised, but the bottom line is there is no national body responsible for interpreting and translating in a deep sense. Of course, there are things, there's hotlines and all of that, but to maintain the expertise that you need to confront challenges like that in the longer term, knowing that we will face such problems again, I put on the right-hand side of the slide, we've had this very timely national investment so we can produce mitochondrial RNA vaccines at University of Queensland, one of our nodes. Congratulations, UQ. Fabulous. But we need to think of language as intimately tied to health. We've heard some of that today as well. So these are some of the aspects in which the linguistic citizen that we all are, it's been something great about CoEDL that we've had that ethos, has lots of work to do. Well, we talked about longevity. It's obviously a loaded word, but I think it's something that is vital, and we heard from Nick T-Berger about Paradisec Archive, and it's something, again, that's been one of our most important achievements, and also one of the ones we can really measure and show how much has happened. Well, that's going to be funded thanks to Aldaco in some way for a couple of years more, but still, what about after that? Here on the left-hand picture, you see Fanny Cochrane-Smith being recorded during the 19th century, and this is like an invaluable archival resource for one of the very few recordings, maybe the only one of Tasmanian language. And then that just shows the value of something like that. If you look at the other three slides, start down here. This was the Museu Golgi in Belém, in Brazil. Wonderful museum with lots of archives. And then during CoEDL's lifetime, it all went up in flames. That was it. There were whole Brazilian tribal nations whose, all the material they had was in there. Linguistic resources, other resources, and they hadn't been digitised or multiplied out. That's just a reminder of how fragile these things are, and when we talk about fragility, we know about the fragility of speakers and how many languages are just hanging by a thread, but then there's a second level of fragility, which is the fragility of resources, and you end up with that right-hand picture. We need to ensure that the resources we've produced and recorded have that full longevity. And I was heartened to hear Liz Fisher's remarks yesterday that the ARC is starting to think about maybe new schemes that are better suited to maintaining things beyond the 7 years, which is the current, longest term things for centres of excellence. But there is other solutions that we need to think about as we start looking forward. And this is just one example to remind us why that's important, that Nick kindly sent me. So this was a recording made, was it by, not Tom Dutton, who? Tom Dutton made the recording, was just there as a sort of tape, and there it was, and it got digitised at a certain point, and then Alligator finally connected with it and heard this recording, 60 years later. And it's deeply meaningful to people to be able to hear these languages. It may be a language that's disappeared completely, or maybe the language is still there, but there's vital information, maybe family histories or clan histories or whatever it may be, that only people in that speech community can still understand and translate. So this is really a huge part of our human heritage that is transmitted through language. Part of our work is to get that documented in some way, working with communities, but then we need to solidify that. So the question that everyone asks, the what next question, here we are at the point where we are at, and at some points 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I mean, it seemed like a possibility that this moment would be accompanied by some statement of, and now let's go with CoEDL 2 or something like this. For a whole range of reasons, that's not how it's played out. So we need to think about, what will next steps be. And actually there's lots and lots and lots of them. I'm optimistic that in a way this is a blessing in disguise, because when we regroup, when we rethink, it gives us a chance to reprioritise, to bring in new people, to design things from scratch, and not to be a prisoner of previous design choices. We designed CoEDL in 2013 with a set of questions, with a set of people, with a set of phenomena, which are vastly different to the ones we have now. Some are the same, some are different. So just on the left-hand side, just for a little piece of internet history, you can see an announcement by HCSNet, which was a previously funded AR scheme, for travel bursaries to the NICTA HCSNet meeting in 2005, posted by Robert Day, giving $500 bursaries to PhD students to attend. And that HCSNet created all sorts of connections that were reactivated when we put CoEDL together. Nick often uses this mallee metaphor for how to survive funding rounds in Australia. That is, there are times of rain and times of drought, and mallee, one of our other national vegetative treasures, with its lignotubers under the ground, can survive these periods of drought. So in a way what we've been doing is growing some pretty big lignotubers through our time. And I also think a useful visual metaphor is of the sort of braided stream. And you can see very much where we're at now. We're just coming to a particular island where some of the channels of the stream will part, and then they come together later on, having gone downstream and be enriched by other channels and streams and rivers flowing into the lake. Very much see where we're at as being exactly, yes, it works exactly here. Okay. And of course, something that's been one of our proudest products, if you like, has been this incredible crop of postdocs, PhD students are all shown here, but the postdocs, that just shows where people have gone to almost every continent. And have, unfortunately, not to Africa, but every other continent we have proud CoEDL alumni who've gone on to get jobs there. And maybe what I'm even more proud of, and as many people have said this to me during today. The way we structured our event over these 3 days was like a sort of growing wave with our new gen researchers presenting on the last day. Well, Felicity is at the threshold because she and Evan were both 40. They were the 2 youngest CIs in the years we started, and then all of the other... Sorry?
We were younger than that.
Oh, really? How young were you?
Oh, 36.
36. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know why that number's stuck in my mind. Anyway, 36. It's good. So the point is, we've got this fantastic set of talent and who have done us proud today and raised all sorts of things that our initial CIT weren't thinking about, or else taken questions we were thinking about much further forward than we had thought possible. So now we're waiting for the next wave. If you look closely, you might see that I took all of these photos. I Googled Indigenous surfers, and that's 3 of the images that I came up with. And the next wave will come. Waves come in sets, and you're not quite sure when the next set will come out, but we've got to be ready for it. And I think we are ready, and we'll by these connections that we've built over these 8 years, and the new ideas and new things we've done. There's a lot that's sort of ready to roll. Not to say that you write the 565 ASC Centre of Excellence proposal overnight. It's a daunting process, but the core of it is the idea and the way of connecting things in an original and exciting way. And meanwhile, we've got all sorts of new projects hatched out of CoEDL. I could have put 30 onto this slide. Unfortunately, some of the most exciting projects to come out of CoEDL, I won't name them, don't have logos, and I didn't want to just put titles, but there are some that do have logos, and these are all, one or another reconfiguration, new questions to have come out that are doing incredible things. You've been hearing about those through the weekly mail-outs going out, and they're still to come there. And also coming soon, probably, well, I was told not to attach any date. I'll just say soon. It's a good English word. The CoEDL legacy site, which Joe and Morgan have been building in an incredibly imaginative and interesting way. I think it will be unique, or until people start copying it. And it's a way of recording what we've done in ways that will allow us to go in, follow a number of stories to various levels of depth. At a certain point, we had hoped to be handing out the little booklet versions today, and you could scan the QR codes and get going, but we had to make a hard choice whether to put time and energy into this event and get it to be as great as it was, or whether to try and do 2 things at once. We chose this particular order, but we'll let you know as soon as it's there, and it will be something that will capture quite a lot of what we've done, obviously not everything. Now this is a moment of thanks, and CoEDL wouldn't have run as beautifully as it did without what for me is by far and away the best professional and technical team I've ever had in my working life. It's just been amazing. And I'd like to thank you all. Some people on this list are here today, others not. And I'll just call people to come up. Your presence is hard. So we've opted for a hybrid version where this will just be a little token and then you have to check your email. I wanted to make sure that for once in your life, reading your email will be a pleasant experience. And while we're talking, this email might land, check your spam box. Because it might come. Romina, please come up. And Jo will be stepping into her shoes, having been such a tapestry through the whole Siobhan. Tina, yours is in the bottom of my bag somewhere. It's gone. Ben. And one of the great things about the Centre of Excellence scheme is it lets you set up your team from scratch. I'd also like to thank someone who's not on the list, but it was Douglas Robertson who was here at the public lecture, because he's helped us, I'll say on the next slide, helped us right through the process, including helping us make key recruitments. Now, I'd also like to thank people who've been responsible for putting this three-day event together. It was quite a tricky process just to know what it was going to be like, and I think people got a bit toey at some points because we wanted to emerge into sort of alternating top-down, bottom-up, look sideways, over your shoulder sort of way, so that it became semi-self-organising. And we had an overarching planning group who was saying, well, let's have 3 days and do it like this. That was Paulo Escudero, Nick T-Berger, Kim Starelli, Felicity Meekins, Romina Pascotic, Morgan Alexander, and Joe Allen. So thanks at that level. And then we had organising committees for the individual day programs. So the Wednesday program, that was James Simpson, Felicity Meekins, Carolyn Jones, Catherine Travis, Jill Wigglesworth, Amanda Hamilton Holloway, Rebecca Defina, Morgan Alexander, and Rosie Billington. So thanks to that group for making Wednesday such a fabulous day of outreach. Thursday, we had Anne Cutler, so although, with terrible heart, we know she couldn't be with us anymore, although she may be looking on from on high, but she did have a firm hand in shaping the program. And then Rachel, Catherine and Janet, again, were just vitally thinking how to put together yesterday. And then today, John, who led that program, and a group that was made up of Lawrence Goodman, Al Harvey, Daniel Barth and Ben Foley. So thanks to you all for such a great job of programming and for your patience in slowly putting it all together. I think it's just been a fabulous 3 days. And then through the time, we've had a whole bunch of helpers who've just kept it all running, making sure it's run smoothly. Firstly, the 2 coordinators to that group, Zura Baratasvili and Huare Huang. Can you both stand up? Tina and Shubo, and now the other group that we've had, Elena Shed, Haugili, Ganjao, Heba Bol Owen, Annika Myers, Marcel Roberta Rambaldi, Sarah Maxwell Smith, Alison Mount, Ruben Thompson, Henry Leslie O'Neill, and Wanyama Whiten, all of whom, can you all stand up so that we can... And then, every member of the CoEDL community, it's been incredible just to feel this energy and creativity flowing through. And I think it's fair to say that everyone's enriched the community in one way or another in unforeseen ways, and that's what's made it such a vibrant 8.25 years. I thank Liz Vischer and through her the Australian Research Council yesterday, but I'd like to do so again now, because it's a scheme that not many countries have. Norway's got something similar. Switzerland has something similar. There's not a lot that have these sort of ambitious 7 to 8 year projects like that, and I think it's a really unique and positive thing. Of course, I'd love it if they went for longer. But still, 7 years is great, and the level of trust and freedom that it gives us is a superb thing. And I'd just like to quote Aidan Byrne, who used to be the director of the ARC, or CEO of the ARC at the time we got it. And he said that the 2 things that he loved about the Centre of Excellence scheme was, firstly, the way it got people talking to each other in bold ways across disciplines, and secondly, that it gave a very supportive and interesting environment for PhD postdoc researchers to develop their ideas in. And I think those 2 things are eminently true. Douglas, I thanked already. Our 4 node universities, ANU, University of Melbourne, University of Queensland, Western Sydney University. For each university participating, it's a really substantial financial support they had to put in, substantial administrative support, and in the case of ANU, this was one of my late 2013 nightmares. They had pledged nothing about infrastructure. So my nightmare was that we were going to be put in a brew cupboard somewhere, and when we had the announcement that we got it, we were told, oh no, we'll put in $600,000 to renovate it, and you can have those corridors of the Coombs building, which became the CoEDL space. But when we started out, as Jane will remember, it was a very dingy, dark, clammy, dusty rabbit warren, and turned into the lovely space it is now. So thanks to ANU and to CAP there. And I'd also like to thank Simon Havley here today, who's the director of School of Culture, History and Languages at ANU, and Simon has just been unfailingly supportive right through. So thank you, Simon, for all your support. So that's it. That's us. We'll go forth. It's not quite the end of CoEDL. There's another 3 months. But before there, Jane, can you please come up just so that we can bracket this? Because you've heard yesterday that a gang of 3 sort of clubbed to sort of persuade me to take this on, and I wasn't very keen. But very luckily, Jane, sort of part of the persuasion, agreed to be deputy. We had wanted to go in as co-directors, and I think that's a term that is a much better description of how CoEDL has been. Jane's done so many things. I could list them. I didn't have the wit to, unless you've got something, to a series of tributes from all of our CIs. I could go on for a long time about all of the things Jane's contributed. But one special thing I want to mention is that Jane has really driven the whole engagement with the wider community in so many ways, and we'll never shirk. Jane will take something on, and whether it's a vast and complex submission to UNESCO, or whether it's making sure that the Pachido's Award gets passed on to Elsie now and AFL-MLA and so many other things. Jane is doing that at the same time as all of the other things, setting up the Summer Scholars Program. So Jane, thank you so much for all you've done.
Today, the good news, the Signals Directorate is going to fund 12 summer scholars.
From me, thank you all for coming from near and far for this, and we will stay in touch and we will make new things happen. This is an enterprise that never ends. So thank you. I imagine that some people are going to be dashing off to fly away. I'd propose that people who are still hanging around and feel like coming for a beer somewhere, that Verity's Lane in the city, you can just Google it, might be a good place to gather together from around about 6 o'clock if you feel like celebrating more informally. So thank you all.